What most Americans don't realize is that when Donald Trump publicly demanded $2.8 trillion in what he described as overdue compensation from Canada, he wasn't engaging in negotiation. He was revealing something far more consequential, a profound breakdown in how American economic power is understood, exercised, and communicated at the highest levels of leadership. The demand itself was extraordinary, not only because of its size, but because of what it represented. A shift away from evidence-based diplomacy toward performance politics disguised as economic strategy. The moment mattered not because of the number, but because of what followed. When Canada's former central banker Mark Carney responded with 3 words, "Show your work," the reaction across global financial and diplomatic circles was immediate. The phrase spread rapidly, not because it was witty, but because it articulated a growing concern among America's partners that U.S. economic assertions are increasingly disconnected from institutional analysis. To understand why this moment resonated so deeply, it's necessary to step back and examine how American economic diplomacy traditionally functioned and how dramatically it has changed. For decades, U.S. trade and financial policy rested on a foundation of institutional credibility. When American officials made claims about deficits, imbalances, unfair practices, or strategic risks, those claims were backed by detailed analysis produced by agencies staffed with career professionals. The Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. These were not merely political instruments, they were analytical institutions whose authority derived from methodology, documentation, and internal review. That institutional culture created a presumption of seriousness. Allies might disagree with American conclusions, but they rarely doubted that those conclusions were the product of real analysis. That presumption is now eroding, and the demand directed at Canada illustrates how far the erosion has progressed. The $2.8 trillion figure did not emerge from a publicly available report, a peer-reviewed study, or even a policy memo. It was introduced in a political setting, framed rhetorically rather than analytically, and presented as self-evident truth. No time horizon was specified. No accounting framework was referenced. No distinction was made between trade flows, investment returns, consumer benefits, or price stabilization effects. In economic terms, it was not an argument, it was an assertion. Assertions, however, function very differently in the 21st century global economy than they did in earlier eras. Power today is not exercised solely through size or coercion. It operates through credibility, predictability, and institutional reliability. Markets react not to rhetoric, but to expectations. Governments plan not around threats, but around trust. When assertions replace analysis, the reaction is not compliance, it is skepticism. This is where the situation became revealing. When Canadian officials sought clarification, not confrontation, but clarification, the response from Washington was fragmented. Different departments gave different explanations. Some suggested the data was under review. Others implied the methodology could not be disclosed. Still others framed the figure as a negotiating position rather than a factual claim. Taken together, these responses conveyed a single message. There was no unified analytical foundation behind the demand. For professionals who operate in economic policy, this absence is impossible to ignore. Large-scale claims about trade relationships require models. They require assumptions. They require time frames. They require transparency about what is being measured and what is being excluded. Without those elements, a figure of that magnitude is not persuasive. It is destabilizing. Mark Carney understood this immediately, not because he is a politician, but because he is an institutional economist. As former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney's professional life has been defined by one principle: credibility is currency. Central banks, trade negotiators, and financial regulators operate in systems where trust determines outcomes. Once trust erodes, leverage collapses. By responding with "show your work," Carney did not merely reject the demand. He reframed the entire interaction. He shifted the burden of proof back to the claimant, and in doing so, he exposed a vulnerability that extends far beyond a single trade dispute. Because when the United States cannot document its claims, it invites a deeper question from its partners. If this position lacks evidence, how many others do as well? That question is not rhetorical. It has concrete consequences. Partners begin requesting independent verification. Negotiations slow. Risk premiums rise. Long-term planning adjusts. This dynamic became visible almost immediately. International media coverage did not focus on Canada's refusal. It focused on America's inability to substantiate its demand. Financial analysts began examining whether similar patterns were present in other U.S. economic positions. Trade officials privately expressed concern that American negotiating credibility was being undermined by political theater. What makes this moment especially significant is that Canada is not an adversary. It is America's closest economic partner. The two economies are deeply integrated, with supply chains that cross the border multiple times before final production. Energy markets, manufacturing, agriculture, and finance are interwoven in ways that make simplistic claims of exploitation economically incoherent. In such a relationship, demands of this magnitude require extraordinary justification. Without it, they signal not strength, but instability. And instability is the one attribute that markets and governments react to most quickly. The underlying assumption behind the demand was that Canada depends more on the United States than the United States depends on Canada. While it is true that Canada's economy is smaller, dependence in modern economies is not measured by size alone. It is measured by substitution costs, price sensitivity, regulatory alignment, and systemic risk. On those dimensions, the relationship is far more balanced than the rhetoric suggested. American consumers benefit from Canadian energy exports through lower prices and supply stability. American manufacturers rely on Canadian raw materials that cannot be easily or cheaply replaced. American financial institutions hold substantial Canadian assets precisely because of regulatory predictability. These are not concessions. They are features of an integrated economic system. When that system is treated as a zero-sum arrangement, policy errors follow. And when those errors are defended through assertion rather than analysis, institutional credibility suffers. This is the broader context in which Carney's response landed. It was not interpreted as defiance. It was interpreted as professionalism. It signaled that Canada would engage on the basis of evidence, not intimidation. And it implicitly challenged the United States to meet the same standard. The viral spread of the moment reflected something deeper than political polarization. It reflected recognition, among economists, policymakers, and informed observers, that American economic leadership is at an inflection point. The tools that once made U.S. influence effective are being replaced by tactics that may generate short-term headlines, but produce long-term damage. Economic diplomacy is not theater, it is architecture. It requires institutions that can measure, model, and explain complex relationships. When those institutions are sidelined, the consequences are not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. Of trust, of predictability, of influence. And this erosion rarely announces itself dramatically. It shows up in subtle shifts, in how partners hedge, how investors diversify, how allies plan contingencies. It appears in quiet decisions made in boardrooms and ministries far from public view. But over time, those decisions reshape the global economic landscape. The demand directed at Canada was a symptom, not the disease. The disease is the hollowing out of institutional competence in favor of performative authority. And once that hollowing becomes visible, rebuilding credibility becomes exponentially harder. Because the next time the United States makes a demand, even a justified one, the response will not be automatic deference, it will be conditional. It will come with requests for documentation, verification, and third-party assessment. That shift alone marks a profound change in how American power is perceived, and it raises a question that extends beyond this single episode. If the United States can no longer rely on the presumption of competence, how will it exercise leadership in a system that increasingly values evidence over assertion? That question did not begin with this dispute, and it will not end with it. But this moment made it visible in a way that cannot easily be reversed, because it demonstrated something that America's partners are now actively factoring into their decisions. That institutional seriousness can no longer be assumed, and must now be proven. The question of whether American leadership can still rely on assumed credibility rather than demonstrated competence is no longer theoretical. It is already shaping behavior across global markets, diplomatic channels, and long-term strategic planning. What happened between Washington and Ottawa was not an isolated misstep. It was a visible data point in a pattern that many of America's partners have been quietly tracking for years. When institutional credibility weakens, the first reaction is not confrontation. It is adjustment. Governments do not announce that they trust you less. Investors do not hold press conferences to explain why they are hedging. Instead, they act silently. They diversify exposure. They shorten planning horizons. They seek alternatives. And those choices, repeated across dozens of countries and thousands of institutions, slowly rewire the global economic system. This is already happening in ways that most Americans rarely see. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and large institutional investors increasingly factor U.S. political volatility into risk models. Trade ministries now treat American policy commitments as conditional rather than durable. Multinational corporations hesitate before anchoring supply chains to U.S. regulatory frameworks that can shift dramatically with each political cycle. None of this reflects hostility toward the United States. It reflects uncertainty. And in economics, uncertainty is often more damaging than outright opposition. The irony is that American economic power remains immense. The U.S. market is still the world's largest consumer base. The dollar remains the dominant reserve currency. American innovation, capital depth, and institutional memory still exceed that of most competitors. The problem is not capacity. The problem is credibility management. Power that is not exercised carefully degrades faster than power that is challenged externally. When partners begin asking for documentation instead of accepting declarations, the nature of leadership changes. Leadership becomes transactional. Influence becomes conditional. And every future negotiation becomes harder, slower, and more expensive. Canada's response accelerated this shift not because it was aggressive, but because it was precise. By refusing to engage emotionally and insisting on analytical standards, Ottawa forced the United States into a position it was unprepared to occupy. The absence of substantiated analysis did more damage than any counterargument ever could. This moment also revealed something uncomfortable about the internal dynamics of American governance. For decades, policy formulation relied on tension between political leadership and professional institutions. That tension was healthy. It ensured that ambitious ideas were tested against reality before becoming official positions. What we are witnessing now is not tension, but displacement, where political performance overrides institutional process. When that happens, institutions stop functioning as filters and become amplifiers. They repeat political claims rather than evaluate them. They defend conclusions rather than interrogate assumptions. Over time, this changes the culture of governance itself. This is not unique to the United States. History offers many examples of great powers that mistook rhetorical confidence for strategic competence. In each case, decline did not begin with defeat. It began with the normalization of unserious decision-making. What made American leadership different for much of the post-war era was not moral superiority or flawless policy. It was seriousness, the understanding that power must be justified, documented, and continuously recalibrated. That seriousness is what allowed allies to tolerate mistakes, disagreements, and even unilateral actions, because they trusted the process that produced them. Trust in process is now eroding. The reaction from Europe and Asia following the Canada episode was not coordinated, but it was consistent. Analysts questioned whether American economic positions could still anchor long-term agreements. Officials quietly explored frameworks that reduced exposure to U.S. unpredictability. Not because alternatives were better, but because predictability had become more valuable than scale. This has long-term consequences. Once partners invest in alternative systems, alternative suppliers, alternative financial infrastructure, alternative dispute mechanisms, they do not abandon them easily. Redundancy becomes permanence. Hedging becomes independence. The cost of rebuilding trust is always higher than the cost of maintaining it. It requires years of consistent behavior, transparent analysis, and institutional empowerment. It cannot be achieved through rhetoric alone. What makes this especially troubling is that the United States still possesses the tools needed to reverse course. Career professionals remain embedded throughout the system. Analytical capacity still exists. The problem is not knowledge. It is whether knowledge is allowed to guide policy. The Canada episode should have been an internal warning. Instead, it became a global signal. Mark Carney's response resonated not because it embarrassed Washington, but because it reminded the world what seriousness looks like. Serious countries document their claims. Serious leaders expect scrutiny. Serious institutions welcome verification because they are confident in their work. The deeper lesson here is not about Donald Trump or one trade demand. It is about what happens when leadership confuses dominance with authority. Dominance can force short-term concessions. Authority earns long-term cooperation. And in a world defined by complex interdependence, authority matters far more. If American leaders continue to rely on volume instead of validity, they will find that their words carry less weight, even when they are correct. That is the true danger of institutional erosion. It does not just weaken bad arguments, it weakens good ones too. The viral nature of this moment should not be dismissed as social media spectacle. It reflected a collective recognition among professionals that a line had been crossed, from aggressive negotiation into analytical emptiness. Once that line is visible, it becomes impossible to ignore. What happens next will determine whether this episode becomes a turning point or a precedent. If American institutions reassert their role, rebuild analytical discipline, and re-anchor policy and evidence, credibility can be restored. If not, future demands, even legitimate ones, will be met with skepticism rather than respect. Leadership in the modern world is not about who speaks the loudest. It is about who can explain their position clearly, defend it rigorously, and revise it when evidence demands. The moment those skills are lost, power begins to decay from the inside. Canada's challenge was simple: show your work. The fact that it could not be answered revealed more than any speech or headline ever could. It revealed that influence today is earned not through intimidation, but through competence. And until American leadership fully absorbs that lesson, moments like this will continue to surface. Not as isolated embarrassments, but as indicators of a deeper structural problem that can no longer be hidden behind rhetoric. If you want clear, fact-based analysis of global power, politics, and economics, without noise, without hype, and without propaganda, you're watching National News Report. Like this video to support independent journalism. Comment below with your thoughts. We read them all. And subscribe for fast, accurate updates on the stories shaping America and the world. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next report.